The test at the end of the second part of the course is not cumulative. So go ahead and forget everything you learned in the first part of the course if you wish to. I hope, though, that you will keep some of it in mind, because we'll be referring back to it over and over again. Couple announcements. Grades for the midterm will be posted by later today. We have them. We just had to figure out how to post them. They will be posted later today. To review, let's say you want to review your exam. Let's say you want to know how you did. You want to know which questions you got right and which questions you got wrong. Well, you attend Lisa's office hours. You can attend my office hours, but I don't have your exams. I'm still happy to see you, happy to talk to you, but I won't have your exams to go over. Lisa will have your exams. Now that the midterm's over, you might be turning your eye to or your mind to the next requirement of the course, which is a paper. Paper's due May 20th. Well, that's not very long. That's not very far away. It's only 14 days away. You might consider starting it. It has to be turned in hard copy. So for those of you watching at home, someone has to turn in your paper. You can come into class. It's a pleasure to have you. But whether or not you come, your paper does have to come, because it has to be here. We're not accepting any attachments or electronic things like that. By the way, one other announcement. If you haven't been keeping up with the videos, this week's video is quite proud of it. You might want to take a peek at it. All right, let's a couple more business things. Let's talk about the paper for a second. Okay, because we haven't talked about it very much. The paper, the requirements and goals of the paper are described in tremendous detail in the syllabus for the course. Now, I urge you to read every word of the syllabus, but especially the description of the paper, because it's very detailed. The general goal of the paper, I will tell you, is to write about a problem relevant to relationships, identify one, write about research related to that problem, and then propose some research to extend our understanding of that problem, maybe solve the problem. And those goals are explained in much more detail in your syllabus. Choose a topic you care about. Why not? You're going to have to do the writing. Make it something that you're interested in anyway. You wouldn't be in the course, presumably, if you weren't interested in something to do with intimate relationships. There are plenty of problems out there, and some of them are suggested in the syllabus. So pick a problem you care about. What you want to submit to us is 5 double-spaced pages. That does not include a title page. You don't want a title page. It does not include references either, I don't believe. So 5 double-spaced pages. Make it neat. Don't have coffee stains on it. If there's spelling mistakes, correct them before you give it to us. We don't want to read that. And then, since you're writing it, and since we have to read them, why don't you make it interesting, please? Why not? I realize that you didn't volunteer to write the paper, but you sort of did by taking the course. So since you have to write it and we have to read it, let's just make this more pleasurable by making your paper fun to read. Imagine that someone you cared about was having to read it. Write it as if that was the audience, someone that you wanted to have a good time reading the paper. So that's any questions about this requirement, Jessica?
I know that we're supposed to reference some studies.
Yes.
For points, can we reference anything, any of the studies that are in our textbook?
You can. You don't want to reference the textbook itself, but you can reference studies in the textbook. Ideally, you would not only reference studies in the textbook. Here's what you cannot reference is a Wikipedia web page. That does not count as research. You could start there, but I wouldn't end there. Any other questions about this requirement before we go on to content? Yes, is that Wiley? Wyatt? Great question. Wyatt asks, does the problem have to be about intimate relationships specifically, since this course is about intimate relationship, or can it be about close relationships more broadly? The answer is B. It can be about close relationships more broadly. It can be about interpersonal relationships, so the topics for this paper are broader than the topic of this course. Just wanted to be sort of related to the broad constellation of relevant subject area. Any other questions? That was a great one. Yes, Vicky? It says so in the syllabus. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it says in the syllabus you sort of have to have this many. I think that, in the neighborhood of between 3 and 5 seems like a reasonable amount, including those. That's a good question, Vicki. Other questions about this requirement? Right, now let's move on to the topic for the day, which is conflict, managing conflict. So before the midterm, Tom Bradbury, in his last lecture, talked about pro-social things, about ways that couples maintain intimacy, create intimacy, support each other, do the things that intimate relationships are all about. We enter relationships for positive reasons. That's what we want. And presumably at the beginning of relationships, all these positive things that we do for each other are most of the relationship, and that's why we continue them. The mystery isn't really, why do we do nice things with our partners? That's not mysterious. We do nice things for our partners because we love them, and that's why we're with them. No, the mystery is the topic for this week. If we love our partners, if we want to be with our partners, and we want them to love us back, why would we ever treat our partners in a way that wasn't positive? Why would we ever be mean to our partners? Ever? Why would we ever do something hurtful to someone we claim to love? That's the mystery. What do people want from their relationships? You want not just freedom from conflict, you want actually positivity. You want love, all the things that we were talking about before the midterm. And moreover, everyone knows how we should treat our intimate partners. Now, I want to refer you back to the fellow that we saw in the film at the end of Friday's lecture. You may recall, I don't remember his name, was him Chuck? Chuck? So this is the guy who'd been to prison a couple times, who, remember we commented that he said, here's what I learned from my parents' marriage. He said, so in other words, this is stuff he learned in childhood. He learned, treat people with respect in your family, don't belittle people, don't be mean to people. Imagine if I asked you, what do you know about conflict, about managing conflict effectively? I'm guessing that there would be, on the whole, a lot of agreement in the class. We already know a lot about how we should treat our intimate partners. We should treat our intimate partners with respect. We should validate them. We should be open to their ideas. We should be tolerant of disagreements. And even in the midst of disagreement, the last thing we should do is get angry. Raise your hand if you're pro-defensiveness. Very few hands. Raise your hand if you think it's okay to throw things at your partner. No hands. We know a lot about the good things to do, and we know a lot about the bad things to avoid. So the mystery is that if we all want the same thing, and we know how to get it, how is it that of all the places where we might lose control, of all the circumstances in which we would do something that we know is the wrong thing to do, of all the people with whom we would lose control and behave in a way that we would regret later, why does it happen so frequently with the people that we love the most? How is it that we treat the people we love the most in a negative fashion? Well, that's the mystery. And it's actually the mystery of more than today. It's a mystery that we will actually be pursuing for the rest of the second half of this course. And I'm not sure we'll get an answer to that fundamental question today. But let's see how far we get. So that's the mystery. Let me talk a little bit about the history. Studying conflict wasn't where relationship research began. Relationship research started, I think Tom told you, looking at personality, actually. The earliest marital researchers, for example, were looking at the divorce-prone individual. The idea being that the person who gets divorced has some kind of character flaw that made your divorce inevitable. And the other people have good marriages because you've got the good marriage personality. And that was maybe reasonable when divorce rates were low. When there wasn't a lot of divorce, you could say, well, divorce is this crazy aberrant thing that happens. But that changed in the 1960s. Divorce rates started to climb, and they climbed high. And suddenly, it was very hard to sustain an argument that divorce was a result of some aberrant personality, because if that were true, then everyone in the world is aberrant. Hard to imagine. Also, as divorce rates climbed, more and more people were going to get couples therapy. When divorce rates were low, there was no such thing as a couples therapist, because there were no couples that wanted or asked for therapy. But suddenly, when divorce was sort of more normative, more couples were going to get therapy. And when they went into that therapist's office, husband and wife or any couple, and sat down, and the therapist said, "So what brings you here?" The big complaint was, "We're fighting. We are fighting," and let's talk about that complaint. What's the complaint? The complaint is, we fight a lot, and we're going around in circles. We fight a lot, and we never get anywhere. We fight a lot, and the same topics keep coming up, and it gets ugly, and we both are upset and crying, and we can't figure out a way out on our own. We want to get out of this. So the people that were hearing the complaint were therapists, clinicians. And what do those therapists need? Those therapists said, well, I need to tell these people something. I want to be able to give them some answer, some response that says, well, here's what you should do. But they didn't really have an answer. Well, social learning theory emerged from this context. So we talked about social learning theory. We talked about it with Tom Bradbury. That's the theory that change in relationships really comes from the way couples communicate and the way the behaviors that they exchange and how they understand those behaviors. Social learning theorists said, look, some people are better at communicating than others. It's a skill. One of the fundamental assumptions here is that there's a skill to managing conflict, and some people don't have it. Some people do have it. But if that's true, that's a very convenient assumption for me as a therapist. Because if there's a skill to doing this well, then I can teach you. If there's a skill, I can teach it. So clinicians were a driving force in research, turning research from personality to studying what couples actually do, how couples actually communicate. They studied conflict. They said, well, if this is the complaint, let's research it. Let's research how couples talk about problems, how couples communicate. Specifically, what are they doing? And then let's develop treatments based on what we observe. So that's sort of where this came out of. Whereas it didn't come out of necessarily a basic research. The research I'm about going to describe a lot today came out of a desire to help people, to find solutions, very concrete solutions. Before we talk about the research, let's define some terms. And the big term today is, of course, conflict. Well, what is conflict? Well, the definition I'd like to focus on was proposed by a guy named Kurt Lewin, one of the godfathers of social psychology, a personal hero of mine, very influential academic. And Kurt Lewin thought of human beings as goal-directed creatures. He said each of us are pursuing goals. And you have your goals and I have my goals. But that's what people are doing constantly. So, what is conflict? Let's read it. Conflict arises when one person pursues his or her goals and in doing so interferes with the other person's goals. Responses to this interference can vary in many ways. Very simple. What is conflict? Conflict is when me working towards what I want gets in the way of you working towards what you want. That state is conflict. When when you're trying to reach your goals, I'm trying to reach my goals, and we can't coordinate them so that we can both do them at the same time. That's conflict. And if that's conflict, it follows that in an intimate relationship, some conflict is inevitable. There is no guarantee that I will have conflict with you, necessarily. Because we're not that interdependent. How about this one? Even more. There's all sorts of people on this campus that I'm never going to have conflict with. Because my goals don't cross over their goals ever. But the more interdependence you have, the more there's an opportunity for my goals and your goals to not coincide perfectly. Now, of course, in a good relationship, a lot of my main goals do coincide. It just so happens that my wife and I had a goal, which is to have another child, and that was something we shared. Imagine the conflict that might have arisen if we didn't share that goal. And that's a problem, because her pursuing her goal, I couldn't have pursued my goal of doing more European vacations, which we're pretty much writing off for the next 18 years or so. Couldn't happen if she reached her goal at the same time. The point is that the more interdependent you are, the more inevitable it is that sometimes my goals and your goals will not overlap. And every single time, it's some kind of conflict. Now, by this definition, conflict isn't a bad thing. By this definition, there's nothing inherently bad about conflict. Conflict is life. There's a conflict every time I reach or I'm going through traffic. There's a conflict every time I want to get home and you want to get home too, and the road is not big enough for all of us. It's the same thing in a house. There's a conflict every time we watch TV and I want to watch something and you want to watch something else. That's a conflict. Conflict doesn't mean bad. So that's a little bit different. You know, it's easy to misuse the language and say, well, there's a lot of conflict. Oh no, that's a terrible thing. By this definition, there's nothing inherently wrong about conflict. What matters is how we respond to the conflict situations. And that's the point that Lewin makes. Responses to this interference can vary in many ways. What do we do when we suddenly are blocked from pursuing a goal that we care about? Well, there's lots of things we can do. So I'm heading towards my goal, and suddenly my spouse gets in the way. Well, of all the people on the planet, your partner is the most likely to get in the way because they're around you the most. So the more interdependent you are, the more it is that your partner will be the one getting in the way because they're around you. Now, what do you do about it? Well, you can imagine there's lots of things you can do about it. One thing you can do is stand and patiently wait for your partner to get out of the way. Another thing you can do about it is get mad. Another thing you can do about it is find another way around. The point being that it's the response that we care about. The conflict itself is inevitable. It's a fact of life. It's like oxygen. What we care about is how is conflict managed? And that's what social learning theory talks about. It's saying it's the way conflict is managed that teaches people whether they're in a good relationship or a bad relationship. These are learning opportunities. Every time a conflict arises, and it will arise, it's a chance to learn something about the relationship. And that's what social learning focuses on. All right, so what's the research agenda? So when all those clinicians started clamoring for research on how to manage conflict, what was the agenda? Well, there's really two questions that come up. The first question is the cross-sectional question. In other words, at a given moment, what is it that unhappy couples are doing? The couples that are complaining, what are they doing wrong? And the couples that are happy, by Lewin's definition, it's not that the couples that are happy have less conflict. They just must be doing something different when conflict arises. Well, what are they doing? Can we pin it down? What is it, specifically and behaviorally, that the unhappy couples are doing that is making them unhappy? And what is it the happy couples are doing that are keeping them happy? That's the cross-sectional question. That's about what's going on at a single time. But then there's the longitudinal question, which you may notice is the question that is slightly more interesting to this course. What behaviors predict the future of the relationship? What's interesting about this longitudinal question is it acknowledges that most couples start out happy. And there's an assumption here, which is that of all the couples that start out happy, some of them are happy and also manage conflict well, and some of them are happy and also manage conflict poorly, and those are the ones that are going to be vulnerable to declines over time. And so it'd be very important to know which are the behaviors, which ways of managing conflict help you stay happy longest. We're going to talk about both these today. Let's start with the cross-sectional question. How do you do it? Well, we talked earlier, this is back before my baby was born and during the methods lecture, about how self-report measures of behavior quickly proved to be inadequate. Remember, we talked about how the early researchers did want to know, and so they asked couples, well, how do you manage conflict? And they didn't get useful answers because people don't know how they manage conflict. All we know is that the happy couples say, yeah, all the good things, we do them all. And the unhappy couples, yeah, all the bad things, we do those all. And since husbands and wives couldn't agree on whether they had even had sex the night before, you may recall, we realized, well, we can't just ask people. Forget that. What we have to do is actually watch them. We have to observe couples. But that's a challenge. And what had to happen was the development of new ways of doing research, new ways of studying how do couples interact with each other. We used to ask them, that's not good enough, so now we have to say, well, how are we going to do it? And so there developed sort of a typical paradigm to observe conflict, which I may have mentioned before when we talked about observational data in the methods lecture. Let me go over it a little more detail now. The early research, first of all, found happy and unhappy couples. And that they did ask people. As we talked about, when you want to know if someone's happy with their relationship, basically asking them is the only way. So they asked people, okay, you can do it through newspaper ads or through radio announcements. You get people who say, I love my relationship, I'm in a terrific relationship, and people who hate their relationship and say, we're really distressed. One good source of the distressed couples, the unhappy couples, was clinics. That's where they got a lot of these couples, people who were looking for therapy. And they said, oh, by the way, you're looking for therapy, would you mind being in a study while you're waiting? And they say, sure, okay, we've got nothing to lose. Now you've got these couples and you bring them to a research room, typically. You bring them to a research room and you ask each spouse to identify a topic. And here's how we introduce it in my research. We say, we'd like each of you to come up with an area of disagreement in the relationship. Now, we don't want this to be something that would make you uncomfortable to talk about. That's not our purpose. But we do want something with a little heat to it. We want something that really matters to you so that talking about it might benefit you. When we say talking about it might benefit you, this is known as a lie. What we really care about is, what we really mean is, talking about it might actually get you to show real emotions, and that's what we're trying to study. But that's not what we say. We say, this might benefit you, but what we really mean is, this might benefit us. And then I think you remember I put 2 chairs out here, and we have 2 people sitting in chairs. One person here, one person there, facing each other. And we have 2 cameras, a camera behind each person's head pointing at the other person. And wires from the cameras connect their images to a single screen. So we can look at their faces at the same time, even though they're facing each other. And then we say, all right, we'd like you to talk about this problem for the next, it varies. Some studies have them talk about it for as little as 7 minutes. I've seen studies have them talk about a topic for as long as 15 minutes. And we say, okay, could you talk about it? Talk to each other, don't talk to us. No need to explain yourself. No, don't look at the camera and say, oh, that's my Uncle Bob who lives in New Jersey. We don't need to know it. Just talk to each other as if you were talking to each other at home. And then we leave them. We close the door and let them talk. We're watching them on a monitor in the other room. And here's what we see. You might ask yourself, well, imagine, what would you experience if you were in that situation? You're in a room somewhere in the UCLA campus. You're sitting in 2 chairs facing each other. And there's a camera right behind your partner's head aiming right at your face. Do you think you could relax in that situation? Do you think you could just ignore the camera and focus on your partner and really be in the moment? Or would you be super self-conscious? Some people are saying, I would be super self-conscious. Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? And I would think so too. I would totally expect that I would be super self-conscious in that situation, and I would not be able to forget that there's a camera pointing at my face. But let me tell you something. People forget the cameras like that. How could it be? How could they forget the cameras? The camera, we make no effort to hide the camera. There's not even a sheet over it. It's just a big old camera. It's black, it's on a podium, it's on a tripod. But when you are sitting across 4 feet from your relationship partner, your intimate partner, and there's your partner's face, and you're talking about a topic, and there's a camera, the camera cannot compete with your partner's face. Your partner's face carries the day. Well, sure, you might say. But surely people they still know you're talking, so they can fake it. They can fake their behavior. Okay, let's pursue that argument. What would they fake? What are you going to do? What would be your motive if you're in that room being taped by researchers while you have this conversation? How are you trying to come across? What's your name? Marina? Sabrina, right. That's right. Oh, right. You just want to sound like I'm not the one causing the problem. In fact, you might want to sound like you don't have a problem. You want to sound like we're a great relationship. Here's the problem. If you knew how to fake having a great relationship, you would have a great relationship. Think about it. Who are you more motivated to please? A researcher or your actual partner? Most people are more motivated to please their partner. So if they could fake good, if they could sort of try to have a better conversation than usual, they would. The problem is that people don't know how. So the conversations that we see are incredibly real. We see people crying, and I'm saying within 7 minutes. We see people shouting. We see people getting mad. Now, how does this compare with the conversations they have at home? Someone asked that question. Some researchers asked the question of how do the behaviors that people observe in the laboratory compare with the behaviors that we might observe at home? And the reason they asked this question is that the behaviors they were observing in a laboratory, and when I say laboratory, I just mean a research room with a camera in it, those behaviors were really vivid. They were seeing a lot of affect, a lot of emotion. Well, if that's what we're seeing in the research room, what would people see at home? So here's what they did. They got people to come to the research rooms, have a conversation in the research rooms, and then they said, now go home. Here is a pocket tape recorder. Next time you feel like you guys are having a comparable heated argument or discussion, turn on the tape recorder and tape yourself if you wouldn't mind, and then bring it in and we'll code that too. So the same couples are now providing data in the research rooms and from home, recording an actual conversation at home. Which was more negative, in the research rooms or at home? At home, every time. Good guess. Which means that as much as we're seeing a lot of affect in the research rooms, it tends to be an underestimate. An underestimate of what's going on in people's homes. That's fun. That makes this research that I'm about to describe to you conservative. The implication being that if we could somehow be a fly on the wall and videotape people in their houses, we'd see even more than we see here. So we see a lot of stuff, and the idea is just to say, well, do we see different behaviors in the happy couples than we do in the unhappy couples? That's the question. That's sort of this first question. And how do we know what we see? And the problem is that coding these videotapes or audio tapes is no easy task. It's actually quite challenging. And one of the first challenges is deciding what to code. So let's say I gave you a videotape of a couple talking about a problem. And I asked you to quantify it somehow, to reduce it, to summarize it somehow. How would you do it? On what basis would you do it? There's a lot of choices. You could code the emotion versus the verbal content. You can code what people say, or you can code the emotions they express, which are two different things. You can imagine I could say, oh, shut up. Or I could say, hey, shut up! Those are same content, different emotions. You can code the nonverbal behavior. Am I looking at you? Or am my eyes wandering? Am I open posture? Or my closed posture? You can code that. You can code sequences. I don't just have to code a specific behavior, I can code patterns of behavior. If one person does one thing, what are the chances that someone else will do another specific behavior? Researchers have done all of this. We'll talk about almost all of this today. Another choice is the difference between microanalytic and global coding. So I've got this videotape. There's two different things I can do with it. One thing I can do with it is say, watch the entire 10 minutes. If you're going to be a research assistant in the lab, I say, watch the 10 minutes and then make ratings on the whole thing. Rate what you just saw. That's the global coding. Microanalytic is much, much harder. In that case, we say, I want you to code every behavior. Research in this vein tends to think in terms of a speaking turn. And a speaking turn is all the time that I am talking and both of us are paying attention to my talking. And my turn ends when you start talking and now we're both paying attention to you. So in this class, my speaking turns are very, very long and yours are very, very short. But in an interaction, you can imagine that I might say, well, you know, it bothers me when you leave and you don't call when you're coming home late. And then your turn might start. You're like, well, I don't want to interrupt you because I know you're working on it and the phone rings as a distraction. And I say, wait, that's not a... You can imagine that you can divide up one person talking, then the other person, then the other person, then the other person. And in microanalytic coding, we code each speaking turn separately. And then count up how many different things we see in that interaction. Regardless, when people code these tapes, there's a principle that we ask coders to keep in mind, and it's this. When I'm talking to my partner or anyone, I'm making choices all the time. Every behavior that I make, that I emit, that you can observe on these tapes, every behavior is a choice from a range of options. So let's say you say to me, honey, it really bothers me when you don't clean the sink after you shave because it's gross. You leave little hairs there. Now I have a response. Here's my response. Well, what is my response? Imagine, this doesn't happen, but when we code, imagine that you're, like a Terminator, and inside your mind you see, there's a screen with all these different response options. And you're about to pick one. One response option is, oh, I didn't realize that bothered you. Well, thanks for letting me know. I'm going to be sure to do it differently next time. Another option is, well, okay, whatever. Another option is, well, you're the one you're so picky. Why are you so uptight about the sink? For goodness sakes, leave me alone. Another option is, well, you leave your underwear in front of the shower, so you shouldn't talk to me about neatness because you're the one that is the one. Every behavior is a choice. And the meaning of our choices depends on being aware of that range. So when you're coding, so then the question is, okay, what response would be considered a constructive response? What response would be considered a positive response? Well, something that, given that you've disclosed an issue with me, a complaint, a response that was open, a response that acknowledged and validated your concerns, would be coded as more positive than a response that was defensive or accusatory. It's very hard to get reliability. The challenge is that you want multiple people to see the same things. You want to train people so that if I brought a lot of you to the lab and I trained you for a while, if you watch the tape, you'd all see exactly the same things. But it's tough. It's tough. So, imagine a couple where one person says to the other person, you jerk. Can you imagine that could be, I'm serious. No, you jerk. You are a jerk. Or the same behavior, I could be sort of teasing you. You know how some couples kind of josh each other? Like, oh, you jerk. You crazy jerk. Well, which is it? A lot of times the meaning is hard to tell. It's hard to tell. So getting people to agree on what's in these tapes is very difficult, but that's the challenge. And it's a challenge that a ton of researchers met, starting with John Gottman in the late 70s. John Gottman, who was really a pioneer of this work. And what did he show? What did he reveal? When he actually got these tapes and coded them and compared what the happy people were doing to what the unhappy people were doing. It took a lot of money. It took hundreds of hours. And what did he discover? He discovered that unhappy couples are more negative with each other than happy couples. Okay. Not a big surprise. In fact, I'll tell you another thing he discovered, that unhappy couples are less positive with each other than happy couples. Okay, not such a big surprise either. But he didn't stop there. And the research on this behavior didn't stop there at all. They went further. They said, sure, we probably knew that the unhappy couples are going to be more negative and less positive. But researchers, once you have these tapes, once you can really look at what unhappy couples are doing with each other, these researchers began to get some insights into some quite specific and less intuitive things that unhappy couples were doing that happy couples weren't doing. Let me give you some examples. This is not an exhausted list. This is not an exhaustive list at all. It just sort of gives you a flavor of what some of this research did reveal that was a little bit more interesting than unhappy couples are more negative. Unhappy couples, when resolving a problem, engage in a behavior called, that clinicians call kitchen sinking. Any guess at what's kitchen sinking? Kitchen sinking is when a specific area of conflict becomes representative of everything in your entire relationship. So you're having a talk about cleaning the bathroom sink, and suddenly we're talking about how I treat your mother, and that thing that happened before when we were going out, and that issue when I was late that time, and suddenly all issues get wrapped up. Happy couples weren't doing that. Happy couples, if we're talking about a problem, we focus on this problem. We don't throw the kitchen sink in there. But unhappy couples couldn't contain it. Their discussions turned out not to be well contained to one topic. Even though that's the issue that they were asked to discuss, it raised a lot of other issues. Unhappy couples were much more likely to engage in self-summarizing. What is self-summarizing? Self-summarizing is a conflict behavior where you say, look, what I'm trying to say is, unhappy couples are very invested in summarizing themselves. Happy couples, in contrast, were much more likely to summarize what the other person had to say. You see the difference. Unhappy couples are focused on their own message and getting it out. Look, let me explain it again. Look, let me tell you again. Look, you don't understand me. You're not hearing me. I'm trying to say, this is what I'm trying to say. Happy couples are saying, let me see if I understand you. That's a big difference. And it's a little bit more subtle. It's not just that the happy couples are more positive. It's how are they more positive? Happy couples are more positive in an outward directed way. What makes it subtle is you can imagine an unhappy couple saying, if I could only get you to listen, if I could only get you to understand, you would immediately see my point of view and the conflict would be solved. The problem is that doesn't work if you're both constantly summarizing yourself. Connection, an actual connection, comes from the opposite of self-summarizing. And you're saying, well, if you just said something, let me see if I understand you by trying to summarize what you just said. Did I get it right? I didn't get it right? Fair enough. Let's try again. Oh, and I did get it right? Oh, that makes me feel great because I understand you. And that must make you feel great because you've been understood. Huh. You can see how self-summarizing gets in the way of all that. Presumptive attributions they found in the unhappy couples. Oh, presumptive attributions. You don't want that. What's a presumptive attribution? Presumptive attribution is when you assume that you know what the other person is thinking. Example. I say, why should we go to your family's house for the holidays? Didn't I just go to the last holiday to your family's house? And wasn't I polite to your mom and everything, even though I don't like her? Here's a presumptive attribution. Oh, you were just doing that to appease me. You didn't really make an effort. You were just pretending. What the? Presumptive attribution is a tough one because it's a form of mind reading. It's a form of saying, I know what you're thinking. Well, the problem is that shuts down communication, doesn't it? If you're having a conversation which is full of presumptive attributions, you are having a conversation with yourself. right? I'm saying, okay, you don't care enough about me. Oh, I know you gave me flowers, but you only did it because you were trying to, apologize for that thing that you know you did that you won't admit, and then you are only doing this. Well, I'm talking to myself now. Presumptive attribution shuts down the other person because the other person is only in a position of saying, well, either I can agree with that accusation you essentially levied at me, or I can suddenly have to say, wait a minute, you got me all wrong, but you're not listening to me anyway. You can imagine, though, that presumptive attributions come up. And they come up more in unhappy couples than in happy couples. Unhappy couples are saying, I know what you're thinking. I know why you're doing all that. Happy couples say, what are you thinking? Why are you doing that? You see the difference? The difference between closed and open. Closed is, I know why you're doing that, so just shut up. Open is, I want to know why you're doing that. Open up. Why are you doing that? What does that mean to you? Open-ended questions are what happy couples are doing. Unhappy couples are doing these closed-ended questions. A related closing technique from the unhappy couples is something called, I didn't put it on the slide, is something called a hostile question. A hostile question is something that looks like a question, but it has no real answer that opens the conversation up. Let me give an example of a hostile question. What were you thinking when you did that? You're not really asking, are you? If you say, what kind of an idiot would you have to be to pay $500 for that? Well, that's not really, that's called a hostile question because the answer isn't, oh, this is the kind of idiot I'd have to be. My point here is these are sort of conflict communication behaviors that really aren't totally obvious, but really distinguish between the couples that are on the way to closeness and the couples that are not. Another example, cross-complaining, kind of more intuitive. If someone says, honey, I have an issue. I don't like the way you are watching television at night when that's the time when we could be together. Well, a happy couple says, all right, you raised the issue, let's talk about that issue. What is it that you'd like me to do differently, or what is it that you're missing? Let's talk about it. That's the issue. Cross-complaining say, oh, that reminds me, I've got an issue too. You're a nag, and you never give me the little space or whatever. A cross-complaining is sort of related to the self-summarizing idea. It's when two people are so wrapped up in their own issues and getting their own issues out that they can't connect and be open to each other's issues. Yes, what's your name? Danielle.
How does cross-complaining differ from kitchen sinking?
It's related. It's related. You can imagine cross-complaining being about the similar topic. So if it's about neatness, you could say, you don't like how neat I am. I say, well, actually, I don't like how neat you are. But kitchen sinking is about expanding. It's about expanding the topics to all these different issues. But they're related. This is all related. Prescription. Prescription is also subtle. Prescription is simply telling people what to do. And guess what? Nobody likes to be told what to do. Now, it's subtle because there's a way to say what you need. You can say what you need in a relationship. You can say, I need more time with you. I want more time alone with you. I want that. But that's opening yourself up. That's disclosing your needs. That's opening. Prescription tends to close. Prescription is when you say, you know what you need to do? You need to wise up, shape up, or ship out. Or it can be more subtle. You know what you need to do? You need to stop doing it on the computer. You need to stop watching TV. And you got to pay attention to me. That's telling you what you need. Well, that shuts you down. Maybe you have a different idea of what you need. The difference between open and closed is open avoids prescription. Open says, here's what I need. How does that fit with what you need? What do you need? Prescription says, I'll tell you what you need, so you shut up. So we've come along. I mean, you see how the research isn't as simple at all as, unhappy couples were just more negative, which would be a trivial result, I agree. It actually got a lot deeper than that. As people got into listening to what couples were actually doing, it became actually revolutionary research. Revolutionary. didn't just look at behaviors. Some of that early work also looked at sequences, patterns of behavior. So if you've got a videotape, you don't just see behavior, behavior, behavior. You can see, over the course of 10 minutes, something develop. You can see the escalation of conflict or the de-escalation of conflict. And what they found is that unhappy couples are more rigid and predictable. What does that mean? It means that unhappy couples fell into cycles that they had trouble breaking out of. So, for example, the way this work is done, it's quite complicated statistically, is I look at every single, let's say, negative coded behavior, negative speaking turn in your 10-minute interaction. And for every time I'm negative, I can compute for a couple the statistical probability that your next behavior will be either also negative or neutral or positive. To give you an example from one study. I can actually compute the statistical probability that if I'm negative, you're negative also. Well, unhappy couples, the probability of negative reciprocity, the probability that one person's negativity was followed like a reaction, like a reflex by another negative behavior from the other partner was significantly higher. The implication being less flexibility, more reflexive reactions in the unhappy couples. Does that make sense? So imagine the difference between unhappy couples is that the unhappy couple says, you just said something that pissed me off, I respond by striking back. I lash right back at you. I don't even think about it. Happy couples, and especially happy wives, I don't know why. Actually, I have many speculations as to why. Happy wives in particular were observed following partner negatives with neutral behaviors. Think about that as a skill. Your partner says, you really pissed me off last night. Ouch. That's a criticism. Nobody likes to be criticized. How do I respond? Screen opens up. I have a behavioral range of choices. Some are negative, some are neutral, some are positive. Which do I pick? Unhappy couples, the screen doesn't even pop up. They go right to the negative. I pissed you off, well, you pissed me off. Happy couples are doing something that takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of effort to say, I pissed you off? Ooh, stings, yes, don't like it, but okay, let's address it. What pissed you? Let's talk more about that. Not an easy thing to do. But what does it get you? What it gets you is, it breaks you out of negative cycles. Because imagine if every relationship was like the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's like, oh, you threw a bomb at me, I'm throwing a bomb at you. Great. And now you're going to throw a bomb back at me? Terrific. Not a useful thing. The challenge in feud situations, and you don't want your relationship to become a feud, is to break out of it. Is to be the one that says, okay, I'm going to break the cycle of negativity. Happy couples were able to do it better. Happy couples, a negative didn't automatically cause a domino effect of negative, 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 negative. You see the issue? Happy couples were able to go, punk, okay, fine. A negative, yes, I get it, I didn't like it, but now we're out of it. Unhappy couples, it took longer to exit negative exchanges. It took longer, they were just in the negative part, the exchange of negativity, back and forth, the bad part. It took them longer to say, wait a minute. Let's get out of this for a second. Which leads to free advice. Don't you be the one to convert a neutral behavior into a negative behavior. Don't be the one to knock over that first domino. Because you know what happens. Puppity, 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 puppity. So this is pretty interesting stuff, in my opinion. And what makes it interesting is it's a close analysis of behaviors that we don't always analyze closely. And one of the reasons we don't analyze them closely is we're usually emotional when these behaviors are happening. We're not in an analytical frame of mind when we're having these conflicts with our partners. No. We're aroused. We're maybe hurt. So we're saddened or anxious or distressed. And that's not a good time to think, oh, how interesting, we're kitchen sinking. Oh, how interesting, this is self-summarizing. No, we're in it. But once these videotapes started to get collected and people could actually see what are couples doing, the subtleties of what it is that unhappy couples were doing were able to be described. Which brings us to escape conditioning. Did Tom talk a little bit about coercion theory and escape conditioning when he talked about social learning theory? Yeah? Well, I'm going to talk about it too. Albert? Arthur? So sorry. Oh, fair enough, Arthur. So Arthur says he tried some of this. Good for you. First of all, extra credit for trying this at home. And he said it did not work. He said his partner said, oh, stop using all that psychology. Well, it raises an interesting point, which is, let's say you are an actual professional psychologist who lectures on these topics for money. Does that mean that every interaction at home happens with like little cherubs swinging and birds landing on your finger, cartoon birds? No. I would not say that it goes perfectly every time, and it didn't go perfectly every time for Arthur. And the question is, well, why? I mean, it's a broad question. If we do this all right, if we know what to do and we do it, is that a magic key that makes our relationships perfect? No. And why not? Well, we'll talk about why not. I mean, that's such a broad question. I actually want to just sort of like put it out there and let it rest for a while. So Arthur, it's a great question. It's kind of a fundamental question. We'll get there. For the time being, let's sort of touch on this other sort of enduring question of this topic, which is, well, why does this happen? You know, when I tell you the difference between that self-summarizing, you don't want to do that, cross-complaining, you don't want to do that, I didn't hear anyone raise their hand and say, no, wait a minute, cross-complaining is excellent. No, I like the closed thing. That's much better than the open thing. I mean, maybe the subtleties are interesting, but again, it doesn't strike you as rocket science. I think it strikes you as like, oh yes, of course. I see a lot of nodding. Like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Arthur was agreeing with it so much that he went home and tried it. So the question is then, why would we do anything else? Why would we ever do anything else except be totally open to our partners, to not cross-complain? Like, why? Well, social learning theory comes out of behaviorism, right? Social learning theory comes out of sort of B.F. Skinner's idea that we do what's rewarding and we stop doing what's punished. So social learning theory has to say that ultimately we must somehow inadvertently reinforce each other's behaviors. So my partner wouldn't nag me if it didn't work. And indeed, some people have talked about a particular pattern called the demand-withdrawal pattern. Did Tom talk about the demand-withdrawal pattern? Well, I'll talk about it again. The demand-withdrawal pattern is a particular sequence that clinical psychologists started to observe in unhappy married couples. And the sequence is basically this. One partner, frequently the wife, has a demand, asks for change, asks for something. The other partner, frequently the husband, does not want to give in to the demand, and so reacts by withdrawing. If I've asked you for change, and you withdraw, what position does that leave me in? It leaves me in the position of asking again louder. But if you didn't want to change the first time, now that I'm asking in a more strident fashion, you aren't going to suddenly say, oh yeah, now I'll change. So if you withdrew the first time, you're going to withdraw more. So the demand-withdrawal pattern becomes a cycle of one partner increasingly strident in that person's demands for change, and the other partner increasingly withdrawing from the relationship, trying to escape from these demands. And the problem is that it can become mutually reinforcing. So in the story that Tom likes to tell, which maybe he told you already, you imagine that one woman says to her husband, you know, I need you to be more involved with the kids. I need you to be more involved taking care of the kids. And he might say, sure, and then not change his behavior at all. Well, what happens? She got a sure out of him. So that's rewarding. She asked for him for change, and he rewarded her by saying, yes, I'll do it. He realized that if I say yes, I'll do it, and I don't do it, she'll stop talking, at least for a few minutes, so that's great too. So he gets rewarded for not doing it. Then, of course, after time passes, she realizes he hasn't changed, so she has to say something a little bit louder. And he's like, and he can say, well, okay, this time I'll do it. And she says, finally, oh, I guess that's what it takes to be rewarded. I got the acquiescence from him when I spoke a little loudly. And he says, boy, all I have to do is immediately give in and then stop the conversation, and I will escape the conversation. That's terrific. But it doesn't actually require change. Well, you see where this is going. Over time, she gets rewarded for being louder and louder and louder, and he is rewarded for withdrawing and like shutting her up without actually making any changes. And soon, she's nagging, which is not something she wanted to do, and it's not something he wants to be on the receiving end of. Meanwhile, he's totally shut down and withdrawn, which is not something he wants to do, and it's not something she asked him to do. But the cycle starts small and becomes reinforcing. Does that make sense? Can you sort of see how those little patterns can be reinforcing? When people say, you know what, I don't have time for this right now. So anything that allows me to escape the situation is reinforcing, even if in the long run it's not what I want to do. That is social learning theory in action. That is how social learning theory explains some of the genesis of these negative cycles. Does that make sense? So we have a lot of data from the 1980s mostly, a lot of data looking at happy and unhappy couples and really picking apart what is it that unhappy couples are doing differently from happy couples. A lot of data on that. Well, researchers immediately talk to clinicians and say, so clinicians, just teach people what to do, teach people to do what the happy couples are doing. Now, of course, Arthur points out that didn't really work so well, but we'll get there. The problem is that the cross-sectional research doesn't actually prove that the behaviors cause the outcomes. Right? It could be that happy couples, being happy causes the behavior. They hadn't actually proved that if you behave a certain way, that keeps you happy. To do that, you had to do longitudinal research. So people started to do it. Of course, it took longer. But people started to do it, started to get couples who were happy, newlywed couples. Bring them into the research rooms, observe them. And here's the first thing they observed. The first thing that we observed. Since this is where I enter the picture. We observed that newlyweds, I think I mentioned this the very first day, newlyweds are all pretty happy. So the range of their happiness is very narrow, and it's all clustered at the top of the scale. The least happy newlyweds are still pretty damn happy. But if you observe how effectively they resolve problems, you get a big split. Newlyweds who are all happy, some of those are happy newlyweds, and also they resolve conflicts in a beautiful way with openness and listening and summarizing the other person. It's gorgeous. Other newlyweds, just as happy, just as in love with each other. When you actually put them in a room and say, okay, now talk about a problem, cats and dogs. They're self-summarizing, they're negative, they're cross-complaining, you name it. They can't do it well. Oh, that's interesting. Well then, we might assume that negative behaviors should predict negative outcomes, right? That the negative behaviors, the couples that are negative as newlyweds, those are the fragile couples. Those are the couples that are likely to decline over time and are more likely to divorce. Leo? Leo's question is, how do you tell the difference between how happy they really are versus how happy they are telling you they are? My answer to that is, I don't distinguish between those two things. If they tell me they're happy, I believe them. Because couples later will tell us they're unhappy in a second. And couples tell us when they're unhappy. And even some newlyweds tell us they're unhappy. But if you follow them over time, the same couples will tell you they're happy and later will tell you they're unhappy. So that's a real change that we're trying to predict. I don't accuse people of lying to us somehow. I don't see a point in it. It's a fair question. So the question for this longitudinal research, the issue was this. The issue was, do negative behaviors predict negative outcomes? And there were a number of studies that showed exactly what you would predict. The most negative couples had the most declines. The most negative couples were the most likely to divorce later. Just what you'd expect. The problem is that not all studies found this. So Gottman and Krokoff in 1989 did research where they brought in established couples. They brought established couples into the lab. And they measured their expressions of emotion. They measured their specific affect. So Gottman's people looked at 5 negative affects: sadness, anger, contempt, anxiety, and there was a 5th one that I cannot remember. And what they found was that cross-sectionally, in other words, at one moment, the happiest couples showed less of the negative affect. And the unhappy couples showed a lot more of the negative affect. Sounds great. But what they showed is, in that study, is that over time, when the wives had been angry earlier, even though that was associated with less happiness earlier, over time, the angrier wives declined less. They actually did better. Those marriages did okay over time. What? Anger predicts better outcomes? What? No. Well, in fact, that study was criticized left and right by me and others. We said, oh, that study was a really badly run study. Their sampling was terrible. The statistics were awful. Ugh, stinky study. So we did a better study. We started with newlyweds, not established marriages. We followed them for not a year, but for they studied a year. We studied for 4 years. They really were combining 2 samples, which you shouldn't really do. We had 1 simple sample of newlyweds. Much better study. I'm really proud of this. And to my disappointment, we got similar results. Whereas some of our negative behavior codes among the newlyweds seemed to predict shallower declines, more stable satisfaction over time. Huh. Why? Why would it be why is it good to be angry? Like, under what sort? How can that be right? How can it ever be true that getting angry at someone's a good thing? Any thoughts on that? What's your name? Kelly. That's a really interesting idea. Kelly says maybe the willingness to express some anger reflects comfort with each other. They're comfortable saying, hey, I don't have to pussyfoot around. I don't have to walk on eggshells with you. No, if I'm angry, I can say, hey, you know what? I'm angry. Because I know you love me, we're close, and I'm not threatened by that. It's an interesting idea, Kelly. Okay, we've heard from Wyatt. How about Micah? Let me try to restate that, Micah. Micah. So Micah says, maybe there are individual differences in the meaning of anger. Maybe couples different. Maybe for some couples, anger doesn't mean a bad thing, and you didn't account for that. You know, maybe one behavior doesn't always have the same meaning for all couples. Interesting idea, Dan. Oh, Dan, very interesting idea, Dan. So here's what Dan says. Dan says, maybe in the newlyweds, by getting angry and expressing honest negative emotion about an issue, they're nipping that issue in the bud. They're preventing that issue from getting worse later. But couples who, in contrast, suppress anger or suppress negative feelings, who are not willing to talk about a problem, well, that problem might fester and then bite them later. Interesting idea. Very interesting idea. Okay, Wyatt. Interesting. So Wyatt discloses too much and says, maybe it's just taxing to have to be positive all the time. And so the people who are positive all the time presumably decline more than the people who just let it all hang out. Similar to Kelly's argument. What's an interesting idea? And all these are interesting ideas, and they were all discussed. They were all discussed when people were sort of talking about this finding. I'll tell you, the one that was discussed most in the literature, the one that Gottman and Krokow, for example, pursued, is the idea that Dan shared with us. The idea that even though there's short-term pain in talking about difficult issues, there may be long-term gain in talking about them. Because by talking about difficult issues, you address them. You resolve them. If you never talk about them, you never resolve them. At least that's the idea. But other people came back and said, yeah, but can't you talk about them in a nice way? I mean, like, surely it can't be positive to sort of lay into your partner and get angry. I mean, these are negative codes. What to do? What to do? Well, if you're a researcher and there's this kind of controversy, you want to resolve it by doing more research. So we did. This is a study. This is a very recent study that was done in Tom Bradbury's lab with Tom and some of his students, including myself back when I was a student. 172 newlywed couples in first marriages. So you got this homogeneous group. Here's the idea. The idea to try to resolve this controversy was that, and by the way, I'll tell you in advance, this doesn't totally resolve the controversy at all. Just gets a step towards it. I don't want to oversell it. And we're trying to predict slopes or rate of change in marital satisfaction over 4 years. The question is, you got these newlyweds, they're all pretty happy. Which ones stay happy versus which ones decline a little bit versus which ones decline a lot? That's what we're trying to predict. And what they did was they coded the tapes twice. Once coding for emotion and once coding for the verbal content. They coded it twice to separate those things. There's what you say and there's how you say it, right? They're saying, this is a problem. And they're saying, this is a terrible problem, you jerk. There's two different things. One of them has a lot of affect, even though in both cases you're saying there's a problem. And the question is, if you separate these things, do they interact? In other words, is there a difference between being negative in your content but positive in your affect? Well, what's that mean? How can you be negative in your content and positive in your affect? Well, it's possible. You say, "Oh, this is a problem. I'm mad at you," but I can also, in the next sentence, still say, "But I still love you, you crazy lug, you big galoot," or whatever. So that's what we did. We tried to look at how different combinations of positive and negative affect, emotion, and positive and negative content, verbal content, predicted the slope of these newlywed satisfaction over time. And look what we found. What we found is this. If you sort of combine, if you divide the newlyweds up into low or not a lot of negative content, or a lot of negative content, and not a lot of positive affect, and a lot of positive affect, what we find is most of these groups have this is just a regular decline. This is just a standard, from newlyweds, you decline a little bit. Standard, standard, standard. The group that was really declining was the group that had a lot of negative content and not a lot of positive affect. In other words, look at this. The group that had a lot of negative content, in other words, they said, look, there's some problems here. We have some serious problems, and we don't need to talk about them. But if this group also had high positive affect, what is positive affect in the study? There were 3 positive affects: humor, affection, and interest in the other person. Humor, affection, and interest. If you had high negative content, but you were able to express at the same time humor, affection, and interest in your partner, if you can manage to walk that tightrope, thread that needle, your trajectory over 4 years looked the same as people who didn't have high negative content. People who didn't have the same kind of problems. Well, that's interesting. Doesn't totally resolve the problem, but it does suggest that you can be negative and protect your marital equality. It's possible if you also, this is actually expressed a different way. Yes, if you're negative, it's bad. But it's really especially bad if you also aren't positive. If the negativity squeezes out the positivity. If you can have the negativity, address the negativity, follow Dan's advice and address the real issues. Follow Kelly's advice and say, hey, I'm comfortable with you enough to be negative with you. But if I'm really comfortable with you enough to be negative with you, I better also be positive with you, eh, Kelly? If I can do that, positive emotion can override the effects of negative content during conflict. Why? Why? What does humor, interest, and affection contribute to the conversations? What's the message? What's the message you're sending? If, in the moment of conflict, in the moment when you are dealing with the most negative things, you are able to say at that same moment, hey, I still love you. In this moment, I love you. That sends a powerful message, because then the message is the love matters more than the conflict. It says, this conflict, I don't like it. The disagreement, no, I don't like it. But it's resting on a solid foundation. And I'm reminding you of the foundation. Even in the midst of this, how do you like that? The conflict might matter to me a lot, might be really important to me, but it's not as important as the positive that connects us. That's the message. Not an easy thing to do, but I invite you to try it. Class dismissed.